Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. Today, we're talking about a group of unemployed college students who, in the height of the Great Recession, launched a media company that would spawn several local technology news websites. When Christopher Wink graduated college in 2008, he had no intention of launching a media company. He just wanted an entry-level journalism job that would allow him to work his way up within the industry. But back then, when newspapers were hemorrhaging revenue and announcing mass layoffs, there weren't a lot of journalism jobs to pass around. So, out of desperation, he and a couple other college friends launched a WordPress blog called Technically Philly. It covered the local tech scene, an industry that at the time was largely ignored by regional news organizations. Eventually, the blog gained traction and profitability, and the growth allowed Wink and his friends to launch local tech blogs in Brooklyn, Baltimore, DC, and Delaware. I interviewed Wink about the early days of running an unknown tech blog, what it takes to launch a site in a new city, and why he's never been all that interested in building out an advertising business. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Christopher, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So you basically helped create this hub of local tech news sites, and it basically came about because you were unlucky enough to graduate college during the Great Recession. Can you talk about that?
Yes. You want me to talk about painful early adult memories? Is that really what you're asking me?
Yeah, and the anxiety of looking for a job.
Yeah, it is. All entrepreneurs are either brave or desperate, and I was more on the desperate side, and perhaps later on there was some bravery, but I think absolutely in our origin story, I'd be the first to admit it was much more about being terrified. So yeah, graduated Temple University in Philadelphia with a couple of friends. We, right after graduation, did the thing that journalists did. I got a fellowship covering. I was shared by two newspapers in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, covering the state capitol. I was going to government hearings. I was, trying to find a great lead inside a electric regulation government hearing. And the plan was to get some great mid-market newspaper job and climb my way back to a big market and be an influential reporter. That was the dream. And this is 2008, and that of course proved really foolish. Both the decade plus decline of newspapers generally was sped even further by the recession, a story we all know. And I was
newspapers were just hemorrhaging jobs at this point. Like this was like a really dark time for the industry.
And it was incredible, and it had been a decade of that. I was an intern at the Philadelphia Inquirer, 4 or 5 years earlier, early in my undergrad career, and they had, while I was there, they had done a 400-person round set of layoffs, and that continued since. So, we recognized, we were smart at least enough to recognize that we ought not sign up for the newspaper lottery, and so two friends and I came back to Philadelphia, where we had some network. It was a large metro market. And we kind of said, let's stay hunkered down here. This is a city we love. We do have some relationships. The newspaper jobs aren't going to come. Let's just try something. And so with these two friends and other friends, we recognize we got to try something. We got to build our own life raft, even if it's just a life raft. And among the ideas was, hey, my co-founder Brian Kirk was already somewhat involved in a tech scene in Philadelphia. I had done some business reporting and I had real interest in regulatory policy and some business reporting, and so we kind of married that together. And Brian had said there's a bit of a tech scene in this city of ours that no one seems to pay much attention to. And so
because you guys were like going to events, or someone was going to like events, and there was like huge turnout or something like that, like tech networking events and stuff like that.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Brian had gone and said, "Hey, there's a couple hundred people at this thing, and they're kind of cool and kind of smart. This seems like more interesting than what you might think, tech reporting has to be." And there was sort of a national conversation that we were aware of, right? Like TechCrunch is happening, and a lot of the, a lot of the tech sites were in that, post.com bubble that had burst in 2001. A lot of that was coming back nationally. So there was a sense it was going to happen locally. So to speed a bit, we just launched a WordPress template, started showing up at events with steno pads, and did the the journalism textbook version of what it would be, and learned a lot of lessons along the way.
And how did the local tech community react to you? Because I'm guessing they weren't really covered all that closely.
Right. So once they realized that we weren't, I don't know, like secret agents or deranged lost people, and we're actually trying to do something, because obviously you're at a, consider any, whatever sub community you're a part of that isn't yet broken into the mainstream. If you're hanging out and some 22-year-old with a steno pad comes up and says, I'm covering this for this publication you've never heard of, because of course, still in the 2008-2009 reign, like, yeah, blogging is almost a decade old, but digital news is not quite a thing. Metro dailies aren't even really, they're probably still doing print first strategies. So it was really strange to say I'm writing for a site. So of course we look bizarre, but once people introduced and they read something that we actually published, and the first few people were okay with interviews, and we did a mix of aggregation but still did a lot of original reporting. As people were introduced to it, yeah, there was a sense, okay, these guys actually are professionally trained. Not that anyone knew what that meant in the communities we were serving. But then there was incredible enthusiasm, right? Of course, once you're introduced to the idea of, wait, you'll do free press that will be written in complete sentences and have some narrative arc, and I actually do want people to read, and you help me understand my own story. That sounds incredible. And there was really quickly people ratcheted onto it quite expectedly.
And when did you start? Like, what was like the early sign that you guys were actually getting traction and developing an audience?
So there's a real answer and an hilarious answer, and I'm going to give you both of them. So the real answer is we did like our first couple like breaking news stories, and a lot of them were decidedly not quite what you'd expect out of a local tech news site, but there was a fire in the building of one of the firms we reported a bunch on, and Sean Blanda, the third guy who we started the original version of the site with, dear friend of mine, wrote about that fire, and that company like wasn't quite sure what they would do next. And another company's founder who read us reached out and offered them space. And that was the first sense. It was two founders whom we actually didn't really know, but we had covered news, and people were using us as a platform, which is obviously exactly what news always is. It's in some form a content platform. So that was maybe a couple months in, and that felt like, okay, things can happen because we shared information in a way that might have been on Twitter. Twitter was obviously quite, still only 3 years old or so at that point, but there was enough traction among our community. It could have happened there, but the community we were covering had not yet coalesced. So the people we were reporting on didn't necessarily know each other yet. So we were turning a light in a dark room that already had people, but they didn't realize other people were in there too. So that's the real answer.
Mm-hmm.
There's a brief one that I am a great believer in self-deprecating stories, because I think organizational myth stories always take out the hard parts, and it's just like everything was great, everyone loved us, and we were perfect. So I like stories of when it didn't work. So a very vivid memory I have was maybe 6 or 8 months in, so a little bit after that story, and we were like, okay, we're a platform, we are something, people are reading us, we are seeing real things happen. We probably had a few more examples of that, where someone reached out to someone else because we wrote a story, and that person, that source, told us, wow, I was shocked that a bunch of people reached out to me after it. I thought I was just this site, who are all these people? And that was all great. So we did the inevitable thing. We're like, it's summer 2009. We're starting a little news site. We're gonna do, and we had done a small conference that had been relatively successful. So we're like, we're gonna do a meetup of our readers and do even more introductions. What an incredible thing! And this is gonna be the start of our business strategy. So we got a meetup, we got a venue. It was at a local maker space. We put out a post, put out tweets. We're like, hey, this is going to be amazing. It's going to be like, we're going to shut this place down because we just did, an event. We had a couple hundred people. We're the biggest deal ever. And literally not a single person came. And it was horrifying. It was still to this day one of the worst moments of my life when we really realized, no, literally no one is going to come. And we had this existential conversation. Well, I remember the maker space organizer couldn't actually come, so we were just using the space. So literally, it was just the three of us. But last minute, he had to pick up something for wherever he was. We came back to the space, and he walked in and he said, "Is this the meetup?" We're like, yeah, this is the meetup. It is the three of us. It's like it's small even for a meeting. So we had this existential conversation on the sidewalk of, oh man, like that's humiliating. We can't devote our lives to something like this. And we have this conversation of, are we going to push through or not? And we said, all right, we need to do a version of this a few times more. And if they go like this isn't working. And of course, we had a couple that ended up being successful, and we learned lessons from that, which is important. But I like remembering there are so many humiliating, earth-shattering failures throughout the pathway, and that's one of them.
So we've seen a lot of local news startups over the years, including, I know there's one from Philly from, what's the guy's name? He helped start TBD.
Jim Brady, Spirited Media,
yeah,
Billy Penn.
yeah.
That's also in Baltimore,
Mhm.
Pittsburgh. Yep.
Yeah, and then we saw the DNA sites in Chicago and New York, and we've seen a lot of hyper local news sites. But yours was kind of unique. I felt like because it was local, but it was also focused on a specific vertical.
Yeah.
Like, do you think people would be surprised that cities outside of Silicon Valley have robust enough tech sectors to support a profitable publication?
Totally. And there are two trends in there. There's a trend that's relevant to technology, and there's a trend that I think is much more related to news generally. And so I share them both because I think different audience would capture both. The tech specific one is, I think we got pretty early. Like, yes, I've had that question for the last 10 years of my life. Well, actually, it'll be the 10th anniversary for us in February of publishing. So for 10 years of my life. Had some version of the question of can it sustain? Can it sustain? What's the metric you look for to prove it? And I think at first intuitively, and then later we were able to articulate what we understood was we weren't covering, and we were quick to chase away the narrative of what's the next Silicon Valley. I think we got that pretty quickly. Of that didn't make any sense. It was never going to happen. That's not what's happening. Instead, just local economies are changing. The types of workforces that any city is going to need to survive at all is going to change, and we're just covering the people who represent the vanguard of that workforce change. And once we grasped that, there was a sense of, yeah, this is going to happen. Literally every city that will still be in existence in 50 years will be able to sustain some daily narrative about that community. So I think we got that quickly to understand that people thought this was dumb because they thought it was everyone chasing being the next Silicon Valley, and they thought that was a fad. I think we got that would be a fad, but it's not what we were reporting on. We were reporting on how local economies are changing and the workforces that make them up. And so that was the actual trend we rode and still are riding. And we think it's just like a much more normal part of, just like every city has a restaurant culture. And no one says, oh, only Kansas City has restaurants because that's where all the restaurants are. Like, no, this is what a city needs to thrive. In the same sense, it's how we view a tech community. So that's one trend. And the more news oriented one, the one that I think that anyone who's interested in how we inform communities, or dare we use the word journalism, I think I'm a believer that what the web changed wasn't content businesses, it was ad-supported content businesses, because those are obviously by nature scale, and there was a time when journalism was the best vehicle for scale, and now it's not. There are way more cost-effective ways to build really, really massive audiences, and that's what we call tech now. Instead, journalism is this incredible way to build relationships and build trust, and so it's much more. We're talking about business models that rely on trust. So for us, we've done quite a bit with talent acquisition. That's a category that we're trying to be challenging in, but the same sense that subscription businesses are competing with membership groups or events businesses that we've also obviously dabbled in. So that, I think, was a big macro trend, was because you're going about quality relationships, you can go really niche, because we don't need the biggest audience. We have a super small audience relative to we're a 20-person team. we should be millions and millions of page views. We're not. A month and a day. And so I think that for me was a critical trend that we got also, that the business model we were building was about a quality set of relationships. And so niche makes sense. And geography is one kind of niche, but so is topical. And if you put them both together, you have really small but a really effective way of getting a community together you actually can do, be a platform on. And that's what obviously media is almost definitionally, is you're a marketplace between two communities, your readers and your sponsors or clients. And in our sense, the double niche helped that. And I think so often going too general waters it down.
And you guys figured out like early on that advertising was just not going to be a viable business model, at least to begin with, because you just didn't have a sales team, and like you said, you didn't have like the mass market like distribution. So you guys kind of, I don't know if stumbled on is the right word, but like you launched this thing called Philly Tech Week, right?
Yep. Yeah. And so apparently I start all my answers to your question with feature leads. So here's one. But I have a vivid memory of a couple months into what would become technically um, uh, hand trembling, calling a bar to ask if they would buy $150 display ad, and and it doesn't make any sense, right? Like we all can say, why is a reporter for a tech site calling a bar to put a display ad? That is one of the single dumbest business sentences that could probably be written.
Yeah.
And I was terrified. And there was a lot there. Like I had called, I was still in my early 20s, but I had already become quite comfortable calling quote unquote influential, important people and asking challenging questions. But just asking a manager if they would talk to me about buying something was one of the scariest moments of my life. And there's a bunch of things that we got from that. One, at the outset, we already were not particularly interested in advertising. Similarly, I think that was intuition first, and then that experience gave us the words to describe it. So I think a lot of us, we were built on the intuition. We were three nerdy kids who followed the industry trends as undergrads, who came out with a lot of strong opinions. And like I think these stories often go, the ideas are probably right. Like we probably should harvest all the ideas from young people. They're just like shitty at execution or follow through or articulating it. And I think like we should do more pairing of take the 20 somethings idea, but take the 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 somethings execution and articulation and positioning or something like that. Because after that hand trembling experience calling the manager, we were able to say, well, yeah, the reason we were intuitively disinterested in advertising is it doesn't make any sense. Obviously, that was a particularly bad example, but more to the point, we had a super tiny audience, and it was just like advertising was almost there's obviously examples that are run to the counter, but on the whole, it's about buying mass. It's about buying a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point. If it's brand, particularly on display, right? Like it's about a lot, not about calls to action necessarily. So we got the words to understand that our intuition of being disinterested in advertising was dead on. And that April, so like we launched in February, I probably did the hand trembling call of March of 2009. And then April, we hosted this little unconference for other journalists where we were talking about what we were doing. And that quickly we had a session of, we will never pursue a display advertising strategy. And 10 years later, that's true. We do a little bit of it more just because it's, an inevitability, but it's not at all a line item. And that was one of the core tenets we got right. And I think that is one of the biggest reasons we've been able to succeed this long.
And how successful was that Philly Tech Week when you launched it?
Yeah, so right, that was the second half of the question I didn't answer. So Philly Tech Week actually took us 2 years to get to. So we did a few events. We had that first unconference with kind of more industry peers. We had that incredibly embarrassing meetup. That incredibly embarrassing meetup where no one came led us doing a fall event. That was a pitch demo event that we sold tickets and got sponsors, and we probably made maybe a few grand. I'm not sure. But I think whatever the number is, it was incredibly big by my standards then, and incredibly, probably embarrassingly tiny now. But it meant the world, and then that led us to a couple other events, and like it grew, and then we launched the big festival, which was Philly Tech Week. That was April 2011. So goodness, 2 years later. We launched it 2010, to do the sales cycle. So in that sense, it was probably like, launching is probably maybe a year to a year and a half after we first started just like showing up at events and doing some reporting. But yeah, big event series, distributed calendar. We as a group organized a few of the events, invited others to be on the calendar to kind of grow its size. Sold sponsorships. I also won't remember the number, but $20,000 or something like that in sponsorship, maybe a little bit more, because I think one of us came on quote unquote full time, because I think we're paying ourselves something like $22,000 a year. Sold some tickets. But it also, like, it was a bit of a rallying cry. There were probably 15 events in the calendar. We did 150 events, last year, or this year, I should say. But probably a few thousand people came up, and it came out, and it just felt like this is something that a news organization can do. We can convene, and that doubled with the advertising approach we took probably really informed our idea that we hated. I was obsessed with hating the idea of what is the business model for journalism. We were always like, it is any business model, but just one that uses the value of journalism or content to strengthen it. So you could be a car wash business that uses journalism to get faithful subscribers or whatever. And so the idea of doing events, which was one of our first ways that we kind of were able to come on full time, or doing subscriptions, or in our case, we have a subscription service around talent acquisition, or if it's native advertising, or all these things that we've done, they all are businesses that exist in the world. They're creative agencies, or they're events producers, or whatever, but you're attacking it in a way saying that journalism is part of the strategy. Journalism is a strategy, not an industry. So Philly Tech Week was hugely successful, both in terms of revenue, but also us crystallizing who we wanted to be and how we wanted to approach this world.
So how did you decide to expand outside Philly into new markets?
Organic outreach is the quick answer. So a few people reached out from Baltimore. Baltimore is our first community. These guys, Mike Brenner, Mike Sobleski, who were tech scene leaders, and there was a membership tech council that was doing some coverage. But there are some people, they don't always use the word journalism, but there are people who say and like and understand that independent newsroom, that idea of being challenging, is how communities get better. A lot of people get scared by it, but we were surprised to find this crew from Baltimore said, this is what we need. We think our community is growing. There's activity. We think this is a part of Baltimore's future. But we don't think anyone's calling bullshit on each other. And someone needs to do that. And we want someone to tell a narrative. We want them to be, we want it to be a news source that wants us to succeed, but also is willing to say what needs to be said. And that's, we're not dropping public affairs journalism every day, but the fact that we'll do the coverage of a company's layoffs, if that company doesn't want it, or we'll do the coverage of accusations of spammy, practices, or we'll do coverage on policies and local government. That was stuff that they reached out and said we needed. And so they helped us introduce to some early sponsors, but I mean, it was a mess, our first expansion, because the point it was my co-founder Brian and I, and basically three of us started the technicallyphilly.com. Sean, Brian, and I built it to got to full time, and that was the point. Sean moved on, still dear friends. Brian and I said there is something here. We want to build a business, not just kind of a blog. And so Brian and I rebranded as Technically and went to other markets. And it was the sense that Baltimore, if Baltimore has interest, others can. But Brian and I were getting our ass kicked because we didn't quite know how to do it and how to do it well. So it was a mess. We were two young reporters who were still figuring out how to do it in Philly and didn't know what we were doing, and learned lots of lessons. But organic outreach is the much shorter answer. Sorry, Simon.
So like you since moved into Baltimore, Brooklyn,
DC,
Delaware,
yep,
DC.
yep,
What's your MO when you're moving into a new market? How do you kind of, because obviously you're moving into a market that already has its own local media outlets.
yeah.
How do you kind of like ferret your way in and kind of carve out your own space for your publication?
Yeah, like the metrics answer, we care about the number of IT and engineering jobs that are open now. That's part of our more mature strategy of choosing to go somewhere. We care about how many corporates there are, if there's a university footprint, some economic development group, some early dollars that might invest in us. That's how we look at an expansion now. We're doing a pop up in Pittsburgh right now, which is it's a wonderful community. Um, so that's how we like first like test out whether it makes sense for us. But how we ferret in is it's yeah, that actually we have put a lot of time into thinking about that. I'm in our CEO role. I am typically part of getting our very first relationship. So I'll do trips. There's usually some community anchor who will introduce us. Um, I'll often that community anchor will get together some of the key stakeholders. I'll share what we do. They'll share about their community, and I'll do some of look. If we have some of the quantitative metrics that we can look up and do, then I'm there for some of the qualitative, how that community talks about itself, and that's a good way for me to introduce what we're about and get those first 5, 10, 15, 20 community anchors to know us and know that we're looking at the community. We try to be really deliberate. I every expansion we've done, I've done a couple 2 to 3 dedicated trips to that place, and it's probably from the first time to an expansion 6 months on the minimum. Um, I think we can continue to shorten that time, but the point is, we know local news always has authenticity challenges, particularly when you're trying to do a multi local strategy. So put a little time there, but then the actual expansion is we lead with editorial. So we say we got to burn a year to a year and a half before we're really going to do much business strategy. So editorial is tip of the spear. We are reporting on a community. We might find some strategic ways to fund that. We do that sometimes with economic development groups. We'll do some underwriting, some native advertising at a launch, but really the answer is how do we ferret our way in? It's with doing what news is best at, building a cohesive narrative about a place that mirrors that place so that place can better understand itself and the people and community they're in. And we have a pretty
And you're usually hiring like a single reporter to
yep,
start with in that city. Like I think when I profiled you guys back in like 2014, you had just launched in DC and you had hired like a recent journalism college graduate um, to basically be kind of like your anchor reporter in that
yep,
city.
exactly. And that the offering gets better over time. There was a time when that was a contractor role, and that was and then it was a part time role. Now it's a full time role. So some of that's also just how we've been able to grow. But exactly, yes. So it's an editorial person. We can be a bit more competitive as we grow. But that's exactly right. That it's a reporter that we have a model and an editorial calendar and some structure, but we do give that person some reign to find that. We have a lot of opinions, I as an individual and we as an organization, about what beat reporting looks like in the web today. It's one of the many things I will happily nerd out about with anyone. So we introduce that to someone about how we approach things. And there's a lot of patterns we find across markets. So we can usually give a reporter a whole lot of a cheat sheet of there's what to expect. But then they roll, and it's a really effective way to build relationships.
And how do you manage your hubs from like an editorial and business perspective? Like, are they mostly operating autonomously, or like do you have editors at like the headquarters who are giving lots of guidance?
Yeah, exactly that. So yeah, so we have we're not every piece we publish has been edited by some other human, which we talk about a lot about how we still have not probably introduced that concept to our readers. We're always amazed when we do feedback. Readers don't like understandably don't understand our the media's process. So yeah, we actually just do more education about we everything is edited. We have an editor. They're doing we're active on Slack because that is a distributed editorial team. We do have editors in NHQ, but there's the Slack updates. There's a newsroom Slack that's very lively with just kind of joke trends. But there's also the daily check in with the editor on Slack. There are weekly one-on-ones via call or check-in. We do a monthly all-team call where we'll sometimes highlight editorial trends, but share things across the market. So we do have a fair bit of newsroom sharing of here's what I'm seeing in Delaware. This is different than DC. What about Pittsburgh? So I think that's some value we offer. We try to say that's why the multi-local strategy is good, both from a scale side. We do have business folks in our communities, but they can share best practices and what deals have worked. Hey, this partnership worked in this city. Would it work over here? Or I know the corporate buyer for this region is based in this other city, but would be relevant. We do a lot of that knowledge sharing. So we're pretty tightly controlled in HQ and distributed staff with a lot of Slack, but weekly check-ins with calls, and the monthly all team call is a big one for our strategy. And we do a 3 to 4 times a year have all team in-person things. It might happen otherwise, but 4 kind of main ways that we see each other, and that's good for the idea sharing too.
And so from a monetization standpoint, you have events, so that there you can both sell tickets and also sell sponsorships. You have kind of like a local jobs board, so any kind of local tech company or basically anybody hiring for any kind of technical position, they can pay to monetize there. And then you said you also kind of introduced advertising. I'm guessing now that you have hubs in several cities, you have kind of like across all the sites, you have a nice mass audience, like especially since you guys are kind of dominating the kind of whole northeastern seaboard. Like you guys now have enough scale to where you can start to attract more typical mainstream sponsors, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, God, I'm probably like the weirdest small media publisher in my. I just can't get excited by advertising. So, frankly, no, we probably do under strategize there. Our native advertising package, which is we do some creative work, and I love that, and I do put that in that category where it is still working with a client to get a call to action and tell a story. Though we have pretty high editorial standards and have some nerdy policies around that I'm really proud of, but. So long answer of saying like, yes, we work with, more regional spenders. So like, yeah, the AT&T or the Wells Fargo or the Comcast or the, Stanley Black & Decker, Vanguard, those kinds of bigger brands we're able to do more with. But still, you land on their sites, it's not a display advertising. Sometimes it'll happen more because there's just targeted opportunities or, certain clients that just is part of their strategy, and obviously we can technically serve that, but we talk a lot about a lot of those teams were doing talent acquisition strategies, it's that jobs board, but we have a bunch in the subscription style where you can subscribe to basically bundle jobs that come with company culture write-ups. That category for me is so much more interesting and exciting. I think it's a truly different business model to compete in talent acquisition. But a long way of saying that, yes, the multi-local does help for that strategy and the kind of clients we can attract. But yeah, I'm still probably lingering on display ad shade that you're probably right that I should get over that. But that's the real answer.
Well, do you think like part of your success came because the tech press was too centered on Silicon Valley?
Yes, definitely. I think even if it wasn't, that's what niche players are good for. There becomes a pipeline where, when I talk to founders or CEOs about their media strategy, I was like, you should use regional general interest press for early support. You should read niche national publications that are for your investor class or your larger enterprise clients. You should, ping national tech press for a different class of investor or perhaps talent acquisition strategies, depending on what your hiring strategy is. But we are really, it's a talent acquisition play, right? Like we're read by technologists and job seekers and people who are interested in knowing that community. And the general early adopters in wherever you're headquartered. So that was a way of saying that, yes, our early success was tied to their lack of interest, but even if there was a sense of them covering a bunch of different metro markets, they would never be able to, or nor would it fit their model that they should cover deeply.
Mhm.
So I think it just was a hole that wasn't quite filled, that we filled, and then now others are have like joined in that conversation, and I'm not sure they'd ever be able to do it, or really they should. And I just think that's the media as an ecosystem narrative, that you want a healthy, robust ecosystem where people can get their story told lots of different places for different reasons and collect different audiences.
Mhm. So how scalable is this? Like, could there be a technically hub in every city of a certain size?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I absolutely think it. I think um, I I like to think, for about 10 years old, there were 7 years of us working in the business where my co-founder Brian and I were definitely transitioning from terrified, inexperienced journalists to founders. And in the last 3 years, I think we've been working on the business where I'm aiming to be a better CEO than I was a journalist. And and so with that further refinement of who we are and what we can be, I think that's where we create efficiencies, replicate the model, understand our core principles, know that trust is what we have that is most valuable, and how can we serve the communities we are in best and sustain our work. Um, but that's what allows us to scale. Us 5 years ago, when we were still in the working in the business, and Brian and I were quite a bit more inexperienced, that probably wasn't going to happen. But yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, those were all the questions I had, Christopher. Thanks so much for joining me. Where can people find you?
I am, as an individual, at Christopher Wink on all the social media platforms. I am still a Twitter adorer, so I'm quite often there following Simon. And also technically, we're all in the normal places at technical_ly. We have city hubs in those 5 markets. We have newsletters that people love. I have a nerdy tinyletter.com/Christopher Wink, as you'd expect. Find me on Twitter following Simon's media news.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Simon.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.